what the residential options are here and of what the programs are that we're really founded upon. I've been at Colgate since the summer of 2015, so I still feel relatively new here, and there's been a lot of bigger picture projects I've been able to be involved in tackling, including renovation of some of our spaces to address some deferred maintenance, getting our new buildings sort of on the map and getting the bed spaces figured out for how big they needed to be, and so that folks could advocate at a bigger level to get them built, and that's really exciting because that's coming on soon. We've also been thinking a lot about just providing a more personable and consistent residential experience, because a lot of the feedback that we receive is that students talk about residential life as though it's like an entity and don't necessarily know the people associated with it. And so that's one of the things I really want to tackle this year, is just developing a better relationship with the student body and making sure that we are approachable and that people know who we are and the many faces that make up residential life, including our student staff. So that's a little bit about me. Before coming to Colgate, I was a staff member at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, and before that I worked at St. Lawrence University, another institution similar in size to ours. I went to graduate school at the University of Vermont for higher education and student affairs, and then as a college student myself, I attended St. Lawrence University. I'm originally from Bennington, Vermont. Any Vermonters in the room? Woohoo! Yeah, so I'm from the banana belt of Vermont. Never picked up a pair of skis till I was 24, but had a really great living experience there, and the liberal arts residential community is really the type of education that I'm most excited about, and so I'm really excited to talk with you all about that today. So, consistent with what I was just mentioning, I want to share with you some of the faces of our department. There are 8 of us. We are 8 strong in the professional staff, and then we have 67 residential fellows and 67 community leaders and 4 residential fellows. And we also partner closely with the common structure, which I'll talk about in a minute. But myself, I serve as the director. We have Brian Reese, who's been with us for a year. He is the associate director, and his responsibilities include overseeing the CL program, and he also directly supervises the assistant and area directors on our staff. Fariza Islam is a graduate of Colgate University. She graduated in 2014, and she's our senior assistant director, and she oversees Hancock Commons, which comprises of Bryan Complex and 94 Broad, and then also we call 113 Broad, the formerly known Cutton Complex, sort of a cousin of Hancock Commons, so she also oversees that area. We recently added an area director position to our staff, and so we now have 5 assistant and area directors, and their position, just like Fariza's, the 4 you see here, and then the 5th one who didn't make it onto the slide is on the next slide. His name is Peter. They all live on campus. They are full-time professional staff, all with master's degrees in adult education or cultural studies or higher education or counseling. And their responsibility is firstly to supervise the community leaders and give them a sense of a holistic sort of leadership development experience as mentors in the community as a community leader. And then they're also overseeing the sort of day-to-day operation of the facilities where you all live, and working closely with the Commons teams and the facilities staff to make sure that everything's operating as it should. Victoria is one of our new staff members, and that's why we don't have her photo yet. We just completed our headshots a couple of weeks ago. But Victoria comes to us from Lafayette College, where she worked in residential life in a couple of different capacities, and she oversees Chakotay Commons. Chimaberi Nwadu is also a graduate of Colgate. She graduated in 2015, and she oversees Brown Commons. And then Esther Rosbrook is the assistant director who oversees Dark Cold Grove Commons. And Peter Vandell is our 5th AD, and he works with all of the areas down the hill where juniors and seniors live. So the townhouses, where he's been very busy this week, the apartments, and then all of the Broad Street houses that aren't connected with the Commons. Tannen Sherman is our assistant director of housing operations. She and I started around the same time. She oversees housing assignments, early arrivals, late stays. She is sort of the front line of any of those operational processes. And without her, a lot of our the train wouldn't be running on time. So she oversees a lot of our operations. So that's the professional staff in residential life. Like I said, there's 8 of us, and all of us new to Colgate in our current capacities within the last 5 years. So it's a pretty new department. Also, as I mentioned, we work really closely with the Commons co-directors, and Chicony Commons was the first Commons, and Mark Shiner and Rebecca Shiner are the leaders of that community. Mark is the associate chaplain. How many of you know Mark Shiner? He's like a presence on campus. I feel like a lot of people do. And Rebecca Shiner is a full professor in the psychology department, and together they lead Chicony Commons with Christine John, who's a residential fellow, and she's new this year. So the residential fellow position is a 1 to 2 year position for somebody who's just out of undergraduate education, who is responsible for really executing the vision of the Commons. So, and they put on and organize and do all the logistics around the programs that happen within the Commons communities. So you'll see their names as they come through here. In Hancock Commons, that group is led by Pilar Mejia Barrera and Antonio Barrera, and their residential fellow is Timothy Howard. Brown, we have Professors Mary Simonson and Jeff Berry, and recent graduate from Colgate Jabari. And then we've got Dark Hole Grove that's led by Aurelius Henderson, who's in the Assistant Dean Suite over in McGregory, and Professor April Baptiste. I'm sure you've taken classes with some of these faculty in particular, or you know them in some way or another, and what's really cool about the Commons is that there's not really one theme that really provides the underpinnings of that community. It's meant to be a place where anyone can really find a home. And so if you know any of these names up here, like I mentioned, Rebecca Shiner is a professor in the psychology department. Pilar is a lecturer in the Spanish and Romance languages. Antonio is a professor in history. They all have a really sort of broad set of disciplines that they are connected to. And they certainly use that to influence the relationships that they have as a Commons, but it's not necessarily a theme, or it doesn't lend itself to any sort of particular programming within the community. So I think that's an important thing to highlight to prospective students and families as they're coming to campus and hear about the Commons and don't necessarily know what it is. It's not necessarily based on a theme. It's really just an umbrella and a community that someone can get attached to right away, and it's new to the community. So particularly the seniors and juniors here, it's maybe not something that you intimately experienced as a first year, so I get that it's sort of a new thing that might be hard to describe. And I certainly want to leave time at the end for questions to answer some of those things and demystify what it means to have a residential commons system. And then, like I mentioned before, we have 67 community leaders. This was our staff last year, some of the wonderful folks who just graduated. And they live in and among first year, sophomore, junior, and senior students. And I'll talk a little bit about what our ratio is, particularly for first year students who sort of need the most guidance and mentorship and attention from our community leaders. But they're a really wonderful group. So the Commons structure, as I've mentioned, so we've got the two co-directors and then the assistant or area director for that Commons and the residential fellow. And each Commons has that structure to sort of provide the collective vision and execution of the programs within a community. And we're really lucky to have sort of a broad set of staffing structure in each Commons so that there's just a lot of attention to what's needed to make everything tick. As of last fall, the Commons program was what we would call fully launched, which meant that every first year student lived within a residential Commons that was led by the folks that I introduced before. And so it's really exciting to say that this year we're in year 2 and we made some changes again that I will mention in a minute. But these are the current buildings that are associated within each Commons. So what we say is if you live in this space, you're connected with that residential Commons. So within each Commons as well, there's a council of first years and sophomore students who are sort of a student leadership board that are intended to help generate some great ideas from the residents in the community and foster great events, and just give students sort of a direct place to voice some things that they want to see come alive in the community. And then there's also an FSEM and faculty affiliate link that I'll talk about in a moment. But that's sort of the structure of all 4 of the Commons. Any questions about that? So the goal of the Commons is to, like I said before, enter students into the Colgate community belonging to something larger than themselves without it being the class of 2022, which is 815 strong, right? You've got a smaller sort of subset community that you can be connected to. You have a shared living experience. And the idea is that with the close connection that comes from the Commons with faculty, certainly the Commons directors who are faculty themselves in most cases. But there's also a structure of faculty affiliates who are sort of a larger web of faculty who attend programs, sponsor programs within the community. And the idea with that is that, and we know from a large body of research that students persist better in higher education, they have a deeper, more meaningful learning experience when they have the opportunity to interact with faculty in meaningful ways outside of the classroom. So some of the most well-attended events that happen in the residential commons are when a faculty member comes and you just share a meal and they talk about how they got into the discipline of economics and how they sort of stumbled their way into that field and what their research interests are and all that. So it really just cracks open the idea that you can get to know your faculty member as a person, which, as you all know, with relationships you probably already have with faculty, is a really significant part of our community and one of the benefits of being such a small place. Over the last couple of years, as President Casey has rolled out his vision, these three words come to mind a lot, right? Ritual, affection, and pride. These are constantly things we're hearing. And the idea is that the Commons is another vehicle to make sure that we're establishing really healthy and spirited traditions in the community, that to be a part of a community where you feel like you belong, you feel like you're noticed, you're seen, and it gives you a sense that you can really be proud of your student experience here. And then on an operational end, it means that first years and sophomores are living sort of in mixed communities, which for most students here is kind of normal now, but 4 years ago, that wasn't the case. It was much more separated. First years lived in some buildings and sophomores lived in others, but in most cases now up the hill, the building is about 50-50. And that will also be the case when our new residence halls open up in the fall of 2019. And then down the hill, we have a social house. 3 of the 4 commons have a social house that the idea behind it is it becomes kind of a living room where social events can take place. And I think each year as we've experimented with how things work in the social house, there are some things that have worked great and some things that we need to rethink. So it's definitely a relationship that's evolving and a part of the program that's evolving, but I think it's a really great idea that down the hill on Broad Street, there's a junior and senior presence that can provide another place for first years and sophomores to go on Broad Street that's connected with their commons and gives them access to a place where we know a lot of social events take place, but might contribute something different than what we know also happens in that location. So, over the last year, so when I gave this presentation to tour guides this time last year, this was a totally different list, and it's really exciting that every year we just get to add more and more to what's been happening. But over the past summer, how many of you live in the apartments, University Courts Park or Newell? So there was a significant renovation project that happened in the apartments this summer around all sorts of complications with summer camps and conferences that live in the apartments, and the Office of Summer Programs really collaborated really closely with capital projects to just go around all the work that was happening. But we replaced the flooring, the common space furniture, and the shades in those apartments, and that was based on really consistent feedback that we've gotten for the last, at least the time that I've been here, if not, and probably much longer than that there were just issues with those 3 things that needed addressing. I wish we could have done more. I think there's a lot more work to be done, but it just really elevates the quality of living in that area, and I think to have a more consistent set of furniture and just a place where people can relax and be a good member of the community in that space, I'm really excited about the work that was done. We also renovated the lounges in East and West halls. So most of our first year inventory has been renovated since the fall of 2015. East and West are an exception to that in terms of the student rooms themselves. But we got in there this summer and upgraded the lounges that are on the first floor there, added in some technology, added some kitchenettes, painted, put in new furniture. So it was a kind of a lipstick renovation, they call it, but really just, again, freshened it up, which was great. And then, of course, we've got the new residential facilities opening in 1 year, and each of those buildings will house about 100 students, and that'll be a mixed first year and sophomore living experience. And each of those buildings will be attached to, one of those will go with Brown Commons and one will go with Cold Grove Commons. And in that, the goal is that we can reduce the number of sophomores living down the hill in the townhouses, that all the sophomores are living up the hill. There will be some who still remain in 113 Broad. But I know, having facilitated housing selection the last couple of years, There are some sophomores that are like, yes, I get to live in the townhouses, and there are some that are like, it feels really far away, and I want to be closer and up the hill. And so I think for some students that'll be really exciting, but that is a shift that's going to take place next fall. Well, actually, this spring as we start to fill the beds for next fall. So we have a full 12-month operational calendar of things that go on from month to month, and we just concluded first-year housing assignments, and just like a few weeks ago. So we really just flipped our timeline this year and worked really closely with the registrar's office in our housing process. So it used to be that in the middle of May, a student would receive their new student housing preference form from our office, and we would receive it 2 weeks later and churn out first-year housing assignments within 2 weeks, and by the middle of June, people knew exactly where they were gonna live. We also, at that time, accepted roommate requests. So about 50% of the incoming first-year class would tell us who they wanted to live with. We would match them based on that information and assign students from there, which created an interesting experience for the 50% who either wanted to go random, as people say, or live with someone that they were matched with through the housing preference form. And then there were some students who felt bad about themselves because they didn't know somebody. And so it wasn't necessarily a choice for them, that they wanted to see what happened with the roommate matching process as it existed. And so starting this past summer, we didn't accept roommate requests from any incoming first-year student, and everyone was housed by virtue of the roommate matching criteria. We reworked those questions a little bit. The sort of essential things like what time you go to bed, what time you wake up, how you like to keep your room, if you use it for a social space or a study space, your comfort with guests in the space, things like that. And we also added some just basic kind of open-ended questions that helped us to get to know students a little bit better. And after we matched them based on what time they go to bed, what time they wake up, those kinds of things, we went back in and looked at the comment section and sort of reworked if we felt like after we got to know them a little bit better, it wasn't going to be a good match. So I feel like this past summer, it was a more personal assignment process than it's been in a really long time. And we also did it later so that we could house students by their FSEM. So we waited until the registrar's office completed their placement process for first-year seminars. They get their information at the same timeline that we do. They place students in FSEMs, and then they send us that assignment list, and then we sorted FSEMs into different commons and assigned by that process. So I'm happy with the outcome. It's been a really different way of doing housing. I know as a first-year student, when I was in college, I lived with everyone else that was in my first-year seminar, or a similar program to it. And they ended up being sort of my home base to come back to in the Merritt Residence Hall at the end of the day. And I feel like right off the bat in the first few days of my first year in college, I got to know my neighbors really well, and they were like community that became home for me. And the idea is that, we've heard from feedback from orientation surveys year after year that people finish orientation and don't necessarily know their neighbors all that well. So they're coming back to the residence hall and they're like, I don't know the person who lives next to me, but I know 6 people who live in another building on campus. There's no value judgment associated with that, but it's also really important that we want you to know who you live next to too, who your residential community really is. So by creating this FSEM connection, we're trying to foster that residential community in a more intentional way. Orientation is happening with a residential group as the home base. And they're also getting connected to their FSEM group. So it's a sort of a different way of orienting students to the community. And then in the fall semester, we have a couple things going on. How many of you are rising seniors and planning to apply to live off campus? Maybe, we shall see.
We are seniors.
Oh, okay, sorry, I think you are seniors. So how many of you are going to be juniors this year? Okay. So the off-campus process is something that is an option for people who are going to be seniors next year to apply to. I noticed in the tour guide manual that you have, there's a mention of the option of living off campus. I think it's really key for you all to introduce this idea really early on, that we are a residential campus unless you are a part of you apply and get approved through the off-campus lottery. We hear often, and I know this is misinformation, and I know that they're not getting this information directly from you, so I put that caveat out there. But we hear from people often who get turned down through the off-campus process. well, my tour guide told me that I could live off campus my senior year. And I know you aren't saying that to them that directly, but the impression that you make on the 4-year living experience really sticks with them. And so it's an option for juniors now to apply to live off campus, and it's extremely limited in terms of the numbers that can live in the village. And we also work on housing students for next semester who are coming back from abroad this semester. So that's about a 280, 300 student exchange in the middle of each year. And then in the spring semester, we select our CLs for the next academic year. We work on our special accommodations process, which is a process that houses students who have a medical need that determines what kind of housing they need to live in. We have our Commons Housing Lottery process, and then we work with the fraternities and sororities to make sure that their houses are filled for the next year. We do interest housing assignments, and then our general housing lottery. The other thing that we added this year was a process called the block housing process. How many of you know what that might be? It's brand new. Okay. I see a couple of hands. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a few minutes because I'm losing my mind here. So our block process allows people to select a group of people to live with without any criteria, right? So they can live with someone who is a group of like 10 other people, but they don't have to be a part of a sorority or have an interest group or whatever. They can just say, I want to live in this group of 12 in this location. Res Life, if you have that option, please place me there. So it gives another option ahead of the general housing lottery that's not based on random numbers. It just gives people the choice to select into this. We do run a lottery within that, but it's not competing with the rest of the campus in order to get that option. So we pull together like 2 4-person Parker apartments and make it a place for a group of 8. Or we'll pull together a bunch of rooms in a Broad Street house that weren't used for interest housing and house a group of 8 there. So it just expanded the number of ways that students could live with a larger group of friends without having to be affiliated with any certain group. Tracy, did you have a question?
Yes, so is this the new alternative to interest housing? Because I heard that was going to stop.
Nope, it's not an alternative. In fact, this past year we rolled them out at the same time. But we did notice that our numbers of applications for interest did go down. And that could mean a number of things, but it's not in place of the interest process. They'll continue to work side by side. But it just gives people an option to live together in a large group without having to develop an interest application. We heard a lot of feedback that you feel like you have to apply or be accepted into some group outside of residential life in order to justify living together. Certainly we heard that about the interest process. So it's not in place of, it's just another option for students. We've talked to some other institutions as we've been developing this process who also have an interest process, and what they've said is their numbers for that have gone down, but the applications have gotten stronger because there aren't people who are maybe fabricating an interest in order to justify living together because they just have this option that they can live together. So that's an interesting perspective and maybe one that we'll see here, but it's just another option for students to live in groups together as upper class students. So I talked a little bit about our first year housing process already. I think, so the off-campus process, how many of you get questions about this when you're out on tours? Yeah, is it pretty common? Okay, so I can go into a little bit more detail. So you apply as an individual. Based on your individual application, we run a conduct check to see that whether or not there's behavior that's been documented that indicates that may impact how you exist as a member of the village community. And then once everyone passes that screen, we tell the applicant pool, okay, you can form together in groups of 8 or fewer. And then each group receives 1 lottery number, and we run the lottery and accept up to 200 people. So whatever number of groups that ends up being changes every year based on the group size. Students can also form a group of 1 and apply to go off by themselves and live off by themselves, but sometimes we do have students who apply as a group of 1, but their 5 other friends also applied as a group of 1, and 3 of them ended up getting off and a couple of them didn't, right? So it's just important that people unify if they plan to live together in a place off campus that they may already have a lease for. with a small number of people, the special accommodations process does play a part, and that does need to factor into our limit of 250. And then in the spring semester, there's a neighbor-to-neighbor workshop in which the mayor of Hamilton and the chief of police and the associate vice president on campus for environmental health and safety comes and talks with students who are going off campus about safety. So that's a little bit about our process. So a couple things to just reinforce that it would be great if you all helped to promote. Yeah, sure.
I just had a question about the off-campus.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if Colgate is trying to eliminate it by building
Sure.
all of these new.
Yeah, that's a totally fair question. And the answer is no. We want it to continue to be an option. One of the things that we'll be able to do with these 200 beds up the hill is to de-densify some of the areas down the hill. So when the townhouses were originally constructed, they were thought to be a good place for 12 to 16. We've only really ever housed 16 in those houses. And we also know that seniors want to live in singles, but in close community with other people, right? So by having more beds up the hill, we'll be able to de-densify a little bit down the hill and create more singles for students to make it more attractive to stay on campus if they would like to, without feeling like you have to go off campus to get that single living experience. And alongside of that, we want to make sure we're doing as much work as we've done in the residence halls up the hill to the areas down the hill. So we started that work with the apartments this summer. But as far as I'm aware, there's no intentional goal to increase enrollment. We're staying at the same target, and I think that's a really common question, and certainly logical if a parent is thinking about sending their student to Colgate. Is the university going to get bigger if they're building new beds? The answer to that question is no, and we're not getting rid of the off-campus option. We're just thinking about particularly the senior living experience in our residence halls, and that it's not currently giving them what they want in their living experience. There's also some places that currently exist in our inventory that we may take offline completely. So there are some apartments in the buildings 3 and 4 of Newell that over the past 5 years have flooded a couple of times if we've had a particularly wet spring. So there are some places that we'll just take completely offline when we have more flexibility to do that. There's some buildings along Broad Street that have really small double rooms that I would love to make singles. So there's like a wish list of things I have in my mind that I'll be able to get to when we have a little bit more flexibility. So it's really just about enhancing and creating a living experience that's more in line with what we know you're looking for. If students are interested in living with someone who identifies their gender identity is different than their own, that's an option that we offer here without question. So on the housing preference form as a first-year student, there's multiple options for how you identify, what your gender identity is, and how you'd like your roommate to identify. And we will match you based on that criteria. And then from the sophomore, junior, and senior year on, we don't pay attention to gender at all. So you can live with someone who is of a gender different than your own, and it's completely up to you. Our ratio of CLs to first-year students in the first-year area in the Commons is 1 to 30, and it gets larger as students progress through their living experience. But one of the reasons we do that is because we know with a smaller ratio, CLs are able to pay more one-on-one attention to their first-year students and make sure that that transition goes well for them at a relational level. I think you probably all know this based on your own experience, but we do offer suites for first-year students, and I think it's important that we say that means a couple of different things. So in Stillman and Andrews, a suite is even between those two buildings, suites are quite different, but it's shared, 2 bedrooms shared by a common space. But in something like Bryan or in 113 Broad, it's shared by a bathroom, and I think that's just important to offer. It's a good option. It's a good thing for us to have both of those options. But people can assume what a suite really means. It's all on our website. People can find that information on our website too. But that's a quick fact that I think is important to point out. We have, as you know, a really large first-year class, and I'm happy to say that when housing them, we didn't put anyone in a room that hadn't been a triple before. There are 27 rooms in East and West combined that have been triples in the past. Last year, we were able to not have them work as triples. This year, we made them triples again. And my goal long-term is to not continue using them as triples, but it's space that we can and will use if we need to. And so we don't have forced triple rooms. We have rooms that are flexible. I know the experience of living in a triple in West is very different than living in a double in West, and we're conscious of that. But cross our fingers, through move-in weekend, things went pretty smoothly, and the furniture is all in where it needs to be, and students feel like they have the room they need. But I know it's certainly a different experience, and that's not our hope is not to leave those rooms as triples forever, but we can say they're not forced triples because they were triples the 4 years leading up to now until last year. And then the other thing to note is that we're really conscious about the health and safety of residents, and so we conduct inspections on a regular basis in line with campus safety's fire safety inspections and fire drills. And at the closing of every semester, we do walkthroughs in the buildings to check for health and safety. So we look for things like covered smoke detectors and things out in plain sight. We're not going through your drawers or anything, it's out in plain sight, just to make sure that things are as they should in a shared living space. So this is a full list of all of the residentially based renovations that have happened since 2015, since I arrived. It's a pretty substantial list. What's not on there is the renovation of the lounges in East and West. I should add that there, but there's just been a lot of work done to sort of get caught up with a pretty significant amount of deferred maintenance, and really in line with the launch of the Commons program, really rethinking what's needed to support a program like the Commons. We're coming together often with faculty and perhaps teaching classes in a residential environment. So there's now a classroom on the 5th floor of Curtis that has the technology needed to teach a class there. There's a great classroom in the Edge Cafe. And in the 2 new residence halls that are coming online, there are seminar rooms and study rooms and an office suite for the Commons, that the 2 Commons that will be based in those buildings. So we actually made a change in the spring semester to take the suites out of the new construction, so they would be all double rooms. Since we offer a large number of suites in Andrews and Stillman, we don't have as many doubles for first years as we have suites, and so that's an option that we're adding in. And then the 3rd and 4th Commons, Brown and Dark Coal Grove, will be connected to each of those buildings. So that's, yeah, question.
What's the future of Gatehouse?
What's that?
What's the future of Gatehouse?
Oh, Gatehouse. How many of you lived in Gatehouse? Did you like it? Or, yeah? Yeah. So it's so funny because, like, Gatehouse has a reputation, right? Like, everyone knows Gatehouse and that it was built as a temporary building and that it still stands, and all of that is true. And it needs some attention from a facilities standpoint. It's safe to live there. I mean, we wouldn't put you there if it wasn't. But it's certainly a building that needs more attention than some of our others. And so there's always conversation about when might Gatehouse not be around anymore. But it is a building that is loved by people at all levels in the university. Members of the board love Gatehouse. Students love Gatehouse. I mean, all over the place. So, and they're large doubles. It's one of the only buildings that's air conditioned. So, yeah, I don't know what the exact future of Gatehouse is. I know that as we think about housing all of the first years and sophomores up the hill, and not having a small group of sophomores sort of separated in 113 Broad and having no more sophomores in the townhouses, we need more beds up the hill to house all the first years and sophomores here. So there's conversation about what the next site of construction might be if that were to happen. And one of the ideas is that maybe Gatehouse could be a place for that, but that's probably years down the line. So until then, Gatehouse houses one of our SRS programs now, and about 60 first-year students, and we know the students who live there love it. So, yeah, that's the complex history of Gatehouse.
This is a a little specific, but I've had a lot of prospective students and families ask me if the new residence halls will be air conditioned.
They
You know
will
if there's
be.
a fan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh my god.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. It's very exciting. I know this week to live on like the 5th floor of Curtis is gonna be rough. Yep. That being said, Drake is air conditioned, and the townhouses are air conditioned, and Gatehouse is air conditioned. Right. So here's I bring that up to say.
Back up to the front.
I bring that up to say that the university makes decisions about what temperature to keep the residence halls at. Facilities makes that decision based on energy consumption and operation of the air compressors and everything to keep all of the buildings cooled at a particular temperature. It's very complex, and I'm glad I don't have their job, but I don't know that the air conditioning will be fully on all the time. Does that make sense? But it will be a building that we'll be able to use for summer conferences and things like that. And in order to be an appealing place to live, I think having that option is really important. So they will be air conditioned. Yeah,
Okay, so the common system is very new.
it is. That's right. Yep.
And from like a prospective student standpoint, can be very vague in
Sure.
the sense that like, oh, you're joining this residential community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are some like concrete things we
Mhm.
can tell prospective students?
Yeah, that's a
to
great
kind
idea.
of help like them understand like more
Yeah.
like the purpose of the common
Sure.
system.
So I'm thinking about some of the traditions that exist in all of the commons. And the first one that seems to be the most popular are brunches with faculty on Sunday mornings. So like, to me, that's illustrative of the breaking down of like the 4 walls of a classroom and building a relationship with a faculty member outside of the lab, outside of office hours, outside of the classroom. I'm thinking of traditions like, I'm also thinking of the support that the Commons programs provides to FSEM professors. So now that we have a true FSEM link and every FSEM faculty member is closely connected to the Commons directors, they can say to the Commons leadership team, like, we want to have this event that's related to this thing we're discussing in class, go for it. And the Commons team will take that idea, pay for it, fund it, schedule it, do all of that kind of thing. So it really provides a more programmatic link to what happens in the classroom. And that's one of the things that the Commons was initially founded on, and it took us 3 years to get to a point where the FSEM was really linked to it. This is probably more like behind the scenes, but most residential communities are run by a Department of Residential Life and a master's level professional and residential assistants or community leaders that turn over every few years. And the really cool thing about the Commons is that it's led by a team of 2 faculty who are presumably here for the long term, right? Who have a 5 or 6 year term to really see this community come to life, and they can provide a more long-term vision and sense of stability for that community, so the traditions can really build from year to year, so that the leadership experience of the CLs can build from year to year. There's just a really consistent sort of approach, and I've seen that now in its 4th year, particularly in Ciccone Commons. They've been able to try things from year to year and see what works and what doesn't, and it's the same crew year after year to kind of implement. So I think that stability and that really solid foundation is a unique thing. I know it's really appealing to say it's like I wish we could say in some ways it was a themed community, because then people sort of know more about what it means to have a commons, but the idea is that no matter what you study, no matter why you came to Colgate, no matter what classes you're taking, you are connected in some way to something bigger than you. And the Commons was founded based on 30 to 40 years of research of assessment data here at Colgate that said students could get to their sophomore year and just not have strong residential community and felt like they didn't belong here and felt like they had to be a part of an exclusive something or other to feel like a place here. And the idea is that this provides that without question as you enter the community. So in some ways that tells more about Colgate than we really want to talk about to the prospective students, because you don't want to say, well, people didn't feel like they belonged here, so we started the Commons. Like, I get that, but it also, I get the messaging around that, right? But for you all to know, like, that's one of the reasons why it's here, is that it gives people something like I am a Chicony Commons member and I'm affiliated for the 4 years that I'm here. And when I graduate, over the course of time, as the program really takes root, there'll be a Chicony reunion every year. Like there's just a connection and a community and a brand and a bond that comes with having this organization that you're tied to just because you're being who you are and you live in that place. And it's not because of any other criteria.
So if you're trying to move most sophomores up the hill, what's gonna happen to like 113 Broad?
I'm not sure what the long-term history is for 113. I've heard of other ideas over the time, and I think as the middle campus starts to develop and sort of the arts buildings go up and things like that, I'm not sure what's going to happen to 113. For the foreseeable future, we plan on continuing to house, especially next year, we'll have a larger sophomore class than we had planned on, right? Because the 815 will stay for next year. So we'll continue to house sophomores in that location. But I think over time it may turn into something else, or maybe it's not there anymore. I don't know. It's another building that's sort of in flux like Gatehouse is. So when you graduate and you come back in 10 years, I really think Colgate is going to look like it's going to have a lot of the same characteristics, right? But there's going to be some new things that are really exciting. I think there's a lot of really good change going on. Good construction, good attention to the facilities that needed it.
I think I know you definitely already mentioned this, but I just want to clarify.
Yep.
We get a lot of the times the questions of how is the FSEM connected to a commons, or are they connected?
Yeah,
And I feel
now
like
we can say yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great to know.
Yeah,
So
yep.
technically, if you have a prospective student asking if when I choose my FSEM, I will live with the students from my FSEM, is that answer still no, or is that
answer is now yes.
Is now
Yep.
yes.
So if I'm part of FSEM 163, everyone in my FSEM is in Dark Cold Grove Commons.
Mm-hmm.
The exception to that, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, so if I'm a Benton Scholar or an Alumni Memorial Scholar or an OUS Scholar or part of the First Gen program, that was all 4 of them, right? The faculty directors of that program have still opted to keep the members of that program living together, and there's one of those cohorts is in each common. So First Gen is in Hancock, OUS is in Dark Cold Grove, Alumni Memorial Scholars is in Chicony, and Benton is in Brown. And so regardless of their FSEM membership, they live together in that common. So that's the one sort of exception, but otherwise, if I'm a member of FSEM 163, everyone in my class lives in my commons.
Okay.
And there's only about 30 students in the incoming first year class that don't live with their FSEM because they're part of a cohort. So it means that everyone who's a neighbor, you have something else in common with them. You're either in an FSEM with them, or you're in AMS together, or you're in Benton together. And the connection to the commons is that's how you start orientation. That's the foundation that's established when you start to get to know Colgate. It's your residential community and your academic community at the same time. It provides that co-curricular link because the FSEM faculty can, like I mentioned, use the commons to sponsor events and things like that. And it gives the commons directors an automatic sort of team of faculty affiliates that help to provide some of that academic community. So yes, the FSEM and commons is now linked, which is so cool. Yeah.
So to go off of that question on the FSEMs, is it all, like our FSEMs all together on the same floor? Or
Nope. They're just within a commons, so they're in proximity to one another. So I don't necessarily live in the same room as someone who's in my FSEM, but they will be housed somewhere in Curtis and Drake if I'm in Chicony Commons. Same in Brown. If I'm in an FSEM that's in Brown, my entire FSEM class is within Andrews Gatehouse or East Hall. So we didn't intentionally place them together in rooms or on a floor. They're just in proximity in the commons. Yeah.
And for Gate Card, is that still with your commons?
Yeah, so if I live in Curtis, I can get into Curtis and Drake because I'm a member of Chicony Commons, which is great because there's some things that some facilities have, some things that they don't. You can go and use the kitchen in Drake if you're a resident in Curtis because that's a bigger kitchen. You can go visit your friends in your FSEM and get into Drake if you live in Curtis. So it really opens up the community access. So if you're a member of Dark Cold Grove, you can get into Stillman or West with your gate card, same with any other commons. Yeah.
If after your first year and you're selecting housing and you move from one commons to another, is it easier to stay within a commons than it is to go to like a inter-commons
Correct.
lottery?
Yep.
But I've noticed how like I switched commons and I'm getting emails still from like Brown Commons.
Yeah.
Do you sort of stay part of both, even if you?
It's up to you. I think over time, we're as the residential options increase for sophomores up the hill, our goal is that you won't have to switch commons in order to stay there. Right now, there are some commons where we don't have all of the beds for the sophomores to stay in Andrews Gatehouse and East and 100 Hamilton. But if you feel you're most connected to Brown, you can continue getting their information. That's up to you. I think over time too, as the alumni base and the program sort of deepens in its connection to Colgate, we'll develop a better mechanism for sort of categorizing who Commons alumni really are and making sure that you're still looped into what's happening in the Commons community, because it's definitely a 2-year residential experience. The idea is that as a first year and sophomore, you're living in your Commons, and then as a junior and senior, you move down the hill, but you can still be connected to what's going on in your Commons. I know Brown Commons has a great social house with music events and things like that. And it's just a really attractive place for people who are juniors and seniors to come and hang out. There's not space for every junior and senior in Brown Commons, though, to live there. So it just provides some other ways to stay connected to the community. Are there questions? We've talked a lot about the Commons, and I know that it's new and sort of we need to demystify it a lot, but are there questions not related to the Commons that you get a lot that I can help answer for you?
Sometimes they're like, what if I hate my roommate and I can't live with them after the match?
Yeah, it happens, right? We know that transition is really hard, and for a lot of people living here at Colgate, it's the first time they've ever shared a living space. The first step is to talk to their CL, and the CL will expect that there's an openness to sitting down and talking together as roommates and figuring out if living in that environment can work, because sometimes it's just a difference of what time you go to bed, or leaving the light on, or having friends in the room when you're trying to study. And if there's a really open conversation about that, a lot of times people make that work with like true compromise that people are comfortable with. And if after the CL has gotten involved and that doesn't work, and the area or assistant director has tried to help and that's not an option, we'll explore other living areas. The thing about, and this is something that's a reality in this moment right now, is first years are getting adjusted. If I'm in an FSEM that's in Brown Commons, my only other options to move are within Brown, right?
So it makes it harder because.
So it limits the options for moving, particularly in this year where we have such a large first year class. Like our housing models prior to this year were built on a certain number of beds left open in each Commons, so that when that flexibility is needed, there are other places to move people. But we just don't have that flexibility this year. And so we're really trying to help students find ways to make it work where they are, and trying to avoid having to move them out of their Commons in order to find a better living experience. But there might come a point in the semester where that's really the best fit for people. But if a room change is needed, we will try to limit it to just what's available in the Commons, so that they're not living apart from their FSEM because they just happened to have a roommate experience that didn't go well. I think it's also important to note that there are more singles available for first years than I think they realize. For East and West in particular, there's a ton of singles in that building, which is pretty rare for first years. I think when we think about our comparison group, and people think if they're assigned to live in a single, they'll never meet anyone, and they're isolated and they're not gonna have the same experience as others. And it's true, it will be different, but it also doesn't mean someone has to be isolated. And so I would say 30 to 40% of our conversations right after we send out housing assignments are with students who were assigned to a single and didn't necessarily want to be in a single. And I'm sure, as you all can attest to now, it's like, what? You don't want a single? Like, it's really sweet to get a single. It's also not for everybody, right? So we did make some swaps between August 1st and now, between people who were in a single and wanted to be in a suite, and people who were in a suite who wanted to be in a single, and we just swapped them. We made about 30 of those changes between August 1st and now. So that's also possible too, to answer your question. If we can swap somebody to find a better fit, we'll do that as well. And we keep sort of a running list with some basic notes about what's going on so that we can match people up.
How would the SRS system factor into all of the housing assignments and
Yeah.
into this Commons experience?
Yep. I think that's a question that hasn't really been figured out yet. So right now there are 3 SRS programs and we house them together and they're all right now located in Brown Commons. But the question has been asked, like, would we have 1 SRS per Commons, or will they continue to stay in Brown, or will they move to another? The 100 Hamilton, how many of you live there now? Are you any of you in SRS in 100 Hamilton? It's a beautiful house with really nice single rooms. There's some really large doubles there too, with a good kitchen down in the ground level. And it was designed with SRS in mind. And right now, 100 Hamilton is affiliated with Brown Commons. But I'm not sure in the long term how it's going to be all factored into the Commons system. And I think the faculty directors of that program are sorting that out.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, my office is located in Drake Hall, and you can always email me if you have any other questions, or if you want to get together and answer some questions, or I'm happy to come back if there are other things that come up. So thank you all for allowing me to join your training today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.